Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Banished for PC. This is a city building game by Shining Rock Software that was released for PC in February of 2014, and it's particularly interesting for a couple of reasons, the first of which being that it's a city building game in this day and age, which is almost unheard of. We haven't really seen a proper city building game since the early 2000s, and yet this thing comes along, and not only does it come along as a city building game in this day and age, but it's also made by one guy. Yes, one guy made this entire game by himself. And that in and of itself is a very impressive feat. So the question then becomes, how is the game itself? Well, as far as the presentation goes, you do have to keep in mind that, once again, this was made by one guy. So what he managed to do with this is pretty impressive, although the visuals themselves are not impressive at all. This thing looks like it came out many years ago at this point. And even though it doesn't look horrible, when you get in close and look at the, for example, citizens of your town running around, they look terrible. They're extremely low detailed, and there's just a lot of really low detail modeling and animation here, so it's more utilitarian than anything else. It's certainly not enough to destroy the experience, but it's not really all that appealing to the eye, except for when you zoom out pretty far. So that is a slight issue. Then there's the sound design, which is also pretty minimal. You only have a couple of tunes that go along with this thing, and they're really not all that great. They're kind of soothing, actually, but they're not particularly impressive and not really all that memorable. They're very simple, straightforward tracks, and the sound effects themselves are, again, pretty utilitarian. They work, and that's about all they need to do. There's also no voice acting, so that might be an issue for some of you, although it really wasn't that much of an issue for me. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is almost non-existent other than an extremely simplistic premise, which is that you are taking control of a group of outcasts who go off to found their own settlement. That's it. That's your entire plot. So there is no real story here, and instead it's the story of your town as you decide to make it. And that leads into the gameplay itself. What do you have to do in this game? Well, it's not like the Impressions city builder games, for example, and the developer cites Anno as a big influence, although I actually haven't played the Anno series, so I can't really speak from that. But this game is actually more of a survival game than it is a straight-up city-building game. You have these various townsfolk that just run around and do the various tasks that you've set them to do, and they all have basic needs. They all need food, they all need shelter, they all need warmth, and you are supposed to provide that by building them houses, by keeping them supplied with firewood and, of course, food, and you have a variety of ways to accomplish this. And on top of this, you're trying to build up your settlement to get access to more and more things and make it more and more efficient and things like that. But there is a certain problem with this particular approach. There is no end game. There is no end goal for this game. You're just building a town and watching it either die out or flourish. And once you figure out a certain pattern, you can generally build up a pretty good-sized town pretty easily. Because once you've dealt with food and hypothermia, there's not really much else you're going to need to worry about. And when you start the game out, you're probably going to flounder a bit for not really knowing what you're supposed to do. Unless, of course, you go into the tutorials and actually go through those and figure out exactly what buildings do what and why you need them and things like that. So the game is pretty accessible despite being a survival-oriented experience. But it's ultimately pretty limited in content. Again, you don't have an end goal you're working towards. You're really just building up a town and watching it expand as you build things, and that's kind of it, really. Or you're like me and you spend the first couple of playthroughs attempting to do that, and you end up with a town that just collapses in on itself until you realize that there's a certain way you can actually build things, and suddenly you don't have to worry about a thing. And that way is not to start with creating crop fields and filling them with crops, because that actually doesn't work all that well. And eventually you just kind of hit the point where you start getting bored. You may think that it's a fairly complex game from what you're seeing here, but it really isn't all that complex. You have various buildings that you can build, and they each have their own various functions. For example, a forester's lodge allows you to have foresters go out into the forest and cut down trees and bring back logs for you to build things with or to turn into firewood. And they will also plant trees so as to keep the forest there in the first place. A gatherer's hut sends out gatherers who will scrounge the forest for various roots and berries and things like that in order to feed your populace, and it's a very efficient way of doing things, actually. The quarry provides stone, the mines provide iron and coal, the blacksmith provides tools, whether it be iron or steel, depending on what resources you've got, and it just goes on and on. And it explains most of this to you in the tutorials, and it's a pretty straightforward game from there. You just assign jobs via the job menu, and you watch your townsfolk just run around like chickens with their heads cut off and do their various jobs on occasion. Sometimes the AI kind of glitches out and doesn't really work all that well. All the while you're having to worry about things like fires breaking out in your town and having to keep wells around to make sure that people actually have the ability to fight the fires. You occasionally run into other disasters that create some pretty big problems, and the weather itself can be your enemy because it's kind of unpredictable at times. And ultimately what you're going to just do is you're going to set everything in motion, and then you're just going to hit the fast forward mechanic and just watch things play out for a while until you feel the need to add some buildings, add some houses, expand the town, create a town hall, things like that. And it ultimately becomes pretty easy. So while it's impressive that one guy made this whole thing by himself, and the game does provide some enjoyment for a while, it eventually loses steam fairly quickly. And ultimately, that's its biggest problem. If it had more content, if it actually had something to work towards, an endgame of some kind, if it had combat of some kind, whether it just be against wild animals or against other towns or whatever it may well be, it would be more interesting. But unfortunately, there's just this distinct lack towards it. And while it's a well put together game for what it is, it's ultimately going to fall to the mod scene to pick things up. And from what I've seen, the mod scene is not particularly strong with this game. At least that's from what I've seen thus far. So that's the big concern with this thing. Is it worth your time? I guess if you pick it up on sale, you can have some enjoyment out of it, and I certainly got some enjoyment out of it for a while, but again, once I figured out that pattern to building all your buildings and figuring out exactly what you need to produce at any given point, it lost steam pretty quickly. So overall, I'm giving this a 2.5 out of 5. It's not a bad game by any means, but there's not a lot to keep you coming back to it. And so what you're going to find is that its appeal is fairly limited. Thanks for watching.